Hey everybody, this is John from pythonbeginners.com, welcoming you to Lesson 7 of my free course at my website called Python Essentials. So in Lesson 7 we talk about these things called functions. So using the definition right from my website here, a function is a set of code that is written with a name attached to it. After you define a function, you can then just type the function name and run that section of code. So let me give you a live demonstration here right in the idle shell. You can use idle to create functions and run them right at the prompt. Now typically you wouldn't do this, you'd put them into different programs, but for learning purposes I still think the idle shell is a great way to just show things and play around with them to pick up the ideas. So I'm going to define a function called goToWork, and I start by typing the word def, which is the key Python word for define. Then I type the name of my function, which is going to be called goToWork. You finish with 2 brackets and a colon. So now I'm ready to provide some Python code to represent the goToWork function. So I'm just going to put in a series of print statements representing what I have to do to go to work every day. So the first step, of course, is to get up, and I'm going to just paste the other 3 steps in so you can see them. Then I'm going to have my breakfast, eat cereal for breakfast, put on pants and a sweater, so I'm going to get dressed, and then I'm going to drive to work. Once I'm ready to commit this function, I'm going to press enter twice, 1, 2, and nothing really seemed to happen, but Python shell now has a goToWork function that I can use, and the way I use it is I just type goToWork followed by the 2 brackets. So when I press enter, it's going to go and use those 4 print statements as part of the goToWork function. Alright, so it just goes back and it prints everything, or does everything that's in the goToWork function. So that's a very basic example of a function. It's not a very useful one because all we're doing is printing 4 things. So let me add a few options to the goToWork function to make it a bit more flexible. So I'm going to actually copy and paste this, and I can do that right in the idle shell. And I'm going to paste it right down here. Okay, now in this version of goToWork, I'm going to use this bracket area up here to define what are called parameters. A parameter is just a variable that's set up to receive information when you call the function. And that again is another definition that I should probably go over. So to call a function is to ask a function to run. So up here when I typed goToWork bracket bracket, I'm calling the function. I'm saying, hey function, I want you to do your thing. So down here I'm going to set up some variables, so when I do call the function I can supply some things, like for example what I want to eat, what I want to wear. So I'm going to have a parameter called food representing what I'm going to eat for breakfast, and then another one called clothes to represent what I'm going to wear. So instead of eating cereal for breakfast, let me just erase that, and instead of putting on a pants and sweater, I'm going to erase that. So here I'm going to use a placeholder, %s, so I'm going to just, whatever food was sent in, I'm going to print it down here, and then at the end of the print statement I have to follow it up with %food. And the same with this one here. I'm going to say put on, and then a placeholder for %clothes. Alright, so now when I run or call the goToWork function, I have to supply 2 strings for this function to work. So let me just commit this function to memory. So there it is. So let me just try running it again the way I did it before, goToWork. As soon as I press bracket, you can see that idle prompts me for food and clothes, but if I just ignore that and I just let the function go, I'm going to get an error message. And it says right here, goToWork missing 2 required positional parameters, food and clothes. So if I run goToWork, if I want it to work properly, I've got to supply 2 things. So I'm going to supply eggs and I'm going to supply jeans. Alright, so what's going to happen is it's going to put those right into my print statements. So there you go, eat eggs for breakfast and put on jeans. So that's a way that you can send data into your function. Now, what if we didn't always feel like supplying those 2 things, and if I didn't supply anything, then I'm going to fall back on my defaults. So in this 3rd version of goToWork, I'm just going to copy and paste the 2nd version because it's almost what we want it to be. This time around I'm going to put some starting values in for food and clothes, so that just in case I don't supply them, it will kick in with the defaults. So I'm going to set food equal to cereal, and I'm going to say clothes equals pants and sweater, just like before. So by doing this, I have the flexibility to call it without parameters or without data or with data. All right, so now if I commit this one to memory, I can go back to saying go to work again. And if I don't supply any information, it will assume that I want cereal for breakfast and I'm going to put on pants and sweater. Now, if I supply just one thing, like that, it's going to take that as the first parameter. So I'm still going to put on pants and sweater, but I'm going to have eggs for breakfast. The only problem is I didn't spell the function properly. So let me try that again. Go to work, eggs. Okay, so it takes the first thing I've sent in as the eggs. Now what if I want to skip over the first thing and supply just the clothes and still eat the cereal? Well, I can do that as well. So if I say go to work, and I can just say clothes equals jeans. So I'm just spelling out what I want clothes to be. So because I didn't supply anything for food, it'll use the cereal or the backup default value for food. All right, so that's a different way that you can send in some parameters and have some default values set up in case you don't send some in. So let me add a third and final version of this go to work function. So I'm going to copy and paste the other one from up there, and I'm going to set food back to a required parameter where I have to supply the data, and the same with clothes. Now in this third version, I'm going to introduce a third parameter called to do. So to do represents a list of things to do. So how do I send in a list of things? Or in other words, how do I set up this function so that I'm telling the function, hey, anything after food and clothes is going to be this other thing called to do? Well, if I put a star in front of it, what that does is it represents a list. Okay, so now when I call this function, anything after the second parameter will be bundled up into this third parameter called to do. So we need to use this in our function, of course. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a print statement that says, here is what I have to do today. All right, and maybe on the next line I'll get a little fancy here, and I'll have a variable called count that starts at 1, and then I'm going to use a for loop, and I'm going to say for item in to do. All right, so we can treat this to do as a list using a for loop. So then on this line I'm going to go print maybe the count as a string, followed by maybe like a triangle bracket that goes right after the number, and then item, just like that. Okay, so it's going to count the items 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and list them in a list here. Now for it to count properly, I've also got to go count plus equals 1, and that's going to increase the count for every item in the list. All right, so I'm going to commit this to memory, and there it is. So now when I run go to work, I'm going to supply my eggs again, if I spell that right. It's an easy word. Okay, there we go. I'm going to wear jeans again. And now anything that I put in after this becomes part of the to-do list, all right? And these are all just treated as strings. So I'm going to say read emails, go to meeting, and maybe a third thing will be a lunch date or something like that. Okay, so it's going to treat the last three things as a list. So when I run this, watch what happens. Okay, so it still does the eggs and the jeans part, and then it breaks into this for loop, and then for every item I've added past the jeans, it treats it as a to-do item, and then it just lists them like that. All right, so that's sort of a more advanced version of a function where you can send in a list of things. Now, typically, if you are doing that, the last thing that you send in is going to be your wildcard with a list. So you always make that your last parameter. That way Python knows where to start treating items as part of the final list. All right, so the other thing we need to look at, though, with functions is the ability to send back an answer. So I'm going to write a function now where we send in a list of numbers, and we're just going to send back the average of those numbers. All right, so I'm going to do a whole new function here, def get avg, and I'm going to send in a list of numbers. So I can use that star, to represent values rather than just a list of strings. All right, so I'm going to come down here, and I'm going to have a variable called avg that starts at 0, and then I'm going to say for x in nums. So I'm using a for loop to travel through the list of nums, and I'm going to say avg increases itself by each x value, and so when I'm done that, I'm going to return avg divided by the length of the list I sent in. So we can use this len function just like we can with typical arrays and things like that, and it'll look at how many nums were sent in and return that to this part of the calculation so I get the right average. All right, so I'm going to commit this to memory. So now I've got a function called getAverage. So there's different ways I can call this function. I can have a variable set up, my avg equals get avg, and then I'm going to send in a series of numbers. So I'll just send in like 4 numbers. All right, and if I press enter, nothing seems to have happened, but what has happened is I called the getAvg function, sent in this list of numbers. This return statement here sent the answer back to my avg. So if I just type my avg, there's my average. Okay, so that's the resulting answer from getAverage. I can print it. I can say print my average is comma str my avg, so that would work. So my average is 72. I can also call the function right in the print statement, so I don't even need my avg. So I can go like this, print the average is, this time I'll just use a comma separator, and then I'm going to just call getAvg right here. So what's going to happen is the answer will get returned right to the print statement. So let me just type in like 3 numbers here. Okay, but I can type in more than 3, so I'm going to type in a whole bunch of numbers, just a bunch of 2-digit numbers as marks. And on the last one, I close the bracket, and then that closes the bracket for the getAverage function, and then that closes the bracket for the print statement. But what's going to happen is, on the fly, getAverage is going to take all the numbers I've sent in and send back a single number average, and it's going to put it right in the print statement. Okay, so the average is, and obviously I'm not rounding that, but you could easily round that off if you wanted to as well. All right, so when you do that, you have different ways to deal with the answer. You can send it back to a variable, you can send it right back to a print statement, but the whole idea is you're getting an answer back that you can then do something with it. All right, let me finish off with another example, and this time, because you can return anything you want to. So typically you'll see a lot of these functions where we're returning just a simple yes or no, or a true or false. So for this last def, I'm going to say is passing, and I'm going to send in a mark. And I'm simply going to say if mark is greater than or equal to 50, then I'm going to return true. Else, I'm going to return false. All right, so there's my simple little is passing. So I can just call it like this. I can go is passing and send in a mark like 87, and I should get back true. But I can also call it like this, is passing, and send in a mark below 50 and get back a false. Now that on its own isn't all that useful, but typically with a Boolean type of return value, you'll call it right inside of an if statement. So I can go something like this, if is passing, and let me just assign a variable first. So I'm going to have a mark equal to 76, and then I'm going to go if is passing, and I'm going to send in that mark, then print you passed. All right, so it's going to obviously print you passed. Now if I set the mark equal to 45 and I copy this code again, I'm not going to get any output this time because I'm not passing. So I press enter and then nothing happens. All right, now if I said instead if passing mark equals false, right? So I can also test for the opposite, and then I can say you did not pass, and pardon the spelling mistakes here. So you did not pass. So now, because mark is 45 and I've asked if it's false, I will get that answer back to me. All right, so there's a good example there of using a Boolean to send back just a simple little true or false to sort of see if something is set to a certain value or not. All right, so in my last example, I'm actually going to go away from idle for this one, and I'm going to show you a more elaborate example using a programming window here. So I'm going to go to my makeperson.py, and I've typed this code up ahead of time, and so because it's a fairly long program, rather than having you watch me type it, I'm just going to introduce parts of it at a time and just introduce it to you and explain it as we go along. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a function called addPerson. So addPerson requires three things: a name, an age, and a gender. And if you watched my last lesson on dictionaries, then you would have seen what a dictionary is and how to define one. So here I'm creating, with that data, a person object or a person dictionary item. So I'm going to set the name property to name and age to age and gender to the gender parameter coming in. And then I'm going to return it. All right, so with this function, what I can do is I can create a list of people, and I can prompt the user one at a time to enter name, age, gender. And as I do that, I'm going to add it to the people list. So I'm going to start a while true. And the first thing I'm going to do is simply ask for a name. And because I'm inside of this while true loop, I may want to quit at some point. So I'm also telling the user that if you're done entering people, just type Q to quit. So if we get a Q, we're going to break out of this loop. If we don't get a Q, then we're going to move on and ask for the age. So I'm using another input command to say how old is that person, and I'm going to convert that to an integer. Now for the gender, I want to ensure that it's a male or a female. So the next part of it is an inner while true loop where we force a male or female. So I'm just asking a third question, but I'm wrapping it inside of an inner loop here so that if they don't give me an M or an F, it's going to keep asking me for that. And in fact, it'll give an error message, invalid entry, try again. Once I do correctly enter a male or female, it's going to break out of this loop. All right, and then the next thing it's going to do is add the person to the list. So the list up here is called people, and it's empty. As I fill in the data, I'm going to add that person to the list. So I go people.append, that's how you add to a list. So I'm calling the addPerson function way up here at the top, and I'm sending in name, age, and gender. So what's going to happen is name, age, and gender are going to go in, and a person object is going to come back out and get directly appended to the people list. All right, so at some point the person's going to be done and they're going to say Q to quit. So when that happens, we break out of the loop and we're just going to simply print a list of the people. So I'm starting with a print statement here, and I'm going to use a for loop to travel through my people list and print them one at a time. Okay, so it's going to look something like this: for person in people, and I'm going to print their name, and then person property name, and then age person property age, and then gender person gender, and then a little line separator between each person in the list. So when I'm done, it's going to go through the list and go to each dictionary item in the list and just print all the data out. So let's just do a live demonstration of this to see how this works. So I'm going to save this, and then I'm going to run it down here. So you can see in my idle shell, it's asking me for the name of a person. So I'm going to type in Fred as my first person. Fred is 45, and Fred is a male. But if I make a mistake and say Fred is a jail or Fred is a tail, that's not going to work. So it won't let me go any farther until I type in an M or an F. So I'll just type M for male. Now it's going to ask me for another person. So this person's name is Mandy. And how old is Mandy? She is 32. And Mandy is a female. And I'll do one more, Tom. Tom is 67, and Tom is a male. All right, so I'm done entering my people. So if I type Q to quit, it's going to go through and it's going to list all these people. And there you go. So these are all dictionary items, Fred, Mandy, and Tom, and it's able to travel through the list and pull the properties out for each item and print it into a list like this. All right, so that's a bit more of an advanced function, but it just goes to show you that you can return different things. So in the first example, we returned a calculation. So this would be like a float answer. In the second example, we had more than one return statement, which you're allowed to do as well. So it'll return either a true or it'll return a false. So this is a Boolean. So to call this, typically you're going to call, because it returns a true or false, you're going to call it in an if statement. Whereas this one up here, because it returns a calculation, you can call it by sending it to a variable. You can call it by just sending it to a print statement. So you can call it in different ways. This third example is literally sending back a dictionary item called person. So when you call that, we're going to call it in such a way that we are adding it to a separate list. So it just sends back a dictionary item and adds it directly to the list. So always be aware of that. When you're writing your own functions, be aware of what kind of answer you're getting back, if any, and have code set up in place to receive that answer. Now, if I go way back to the beginning of this video, and we're almost done now, if I come way back up to where I defined the go to work function, for example. So here's an example here, the last one we did, where we're sending in food, clothes, and to do. This function's not returning anything. So I'm able to just call the function like a command, go to work, because I'm not expecting an answer back. So I don't have to send this to a print statement or an if statement or add it to a list or a variable. Because there's no return statement, I can just say go to work and it'll just do all the things that are in that command or in that function. So that's a lot to take in this 20-minute video that we just did. But hopefully that gives you a good foundation of what functions are and how to use them in Python. So as always, I am John from PythonBeginners.com. Thank you for watching. And if you've come this far, you've only got one lesson left, and that is going to be data files, and then we're done the Python Essentials course. In this last lesson, we're going to be revisiting pretty much all the other lessons that we've done. So stay tuned for that. And that'll give you a good review of how to put all of these into place into a real, live, large-scale program. Thanks for watching, and this is John from PythonBeginners.com. Bye for now.